Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. It's more than a decade now since the Chinese writer Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2012. Now a new literary prize is seeking to put the spotlight on contemporary Chinese language literature in English translation. The US-based China Books Review recently announced the first winners of the Baifang Shell Book Prize in two categories, one for books about China in English and another for translated literature. With an ever-growing number of literary translators and a well-resourced Chinese publishing industry which is keen to expand globally, this could seem like a significant moment. But with continuing censorship in China and the rising popularity of often throwaway internet writing, can Chinese fiction remain relevant and viable? And with heightened tensions between China and the West in the last few years, is there still the same international interest from readers and publishers? To discuss the prospects for Chinese literature today, we're joined by two of the leading translators of Chinese writing into English. Jeremy Tiang, originally from Singapore and now living in New York, and himself a published novelist and playwright. And Nikki Harman, a founding member of the Chinese literature website Paper Republic and translator of a string of writers including Jia Pinghua, Yan Geling and Dorothy Tsi. And we're also joined by Daniel Lee of Sinoist Books, a British-based publisher which is seeking to shake up the world of Chinese-English translation. Welcome all of you to China in Context. Now, Nikki Harman, you were actually one of the judges for the recent Baifang Shell Prize for Literature translated from the Chinese language. How important a development do you think this prize is in the current climate?
I think it's hugely important, and I was really delighted to get the chance to be on the jury. It was fantastic because we got so many different kinds of books, and note the Chinese language. So we had books from Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan and mainland China, of course. So I actually think that this has been something that's been missing for many years. Most other major languages have prizes for that language into English or some form of literary prize for translated work. And Chinese doesn't. So I think this is great and hope it carries on.
Just as you mentioned the jury, so the jury also included your Paper Republic colleague Eric Abramson and the well-known sinologist and scholar Perry Link, as well as the British-based writer and novelist Xiao Lu Guo and the US-based novelist Ha Jin. But you came up with a winning novel which is quite unusual, and it's actually a Taiwanese novel but with a strong Japanese-Taiwanese historical theme. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
It's Taiwan travelogue, Yang Shuangzi, and translated by Lin King. It was fascinating. It was very beautiful. I mean, you and I have talked before about the lack of internal writing in a lot of Chinese fiction. Well, there was a lot of internal writing. There were thoughts, there was analysis, there were emotions, there were impressions. It was really beautiful. It was about the relationship between two women, one traveling from Japan and one interpreter.
And it's set in the late 1930s, so it's in the context of Taiwan being at the time still a Japanese colony, and this quite radical young woman writer from Japan comes to Taiwan and wants to learn all about the place and its culture and particularly its food. And then she meets a young interpreter who's translating from Chinese or Taiwanese. There seems to be a lot of dialect in there as well, Fujian dialect or Hokkien dialect. And she's translating all of that into Japanese in the story. And the story is, as you say, it's very much about what happens in their relationship and how that develops.
Multiple levels of Chinese culture, Taiwan culture, Japanese culture. And then I have to take my hat off to the translator because of all these different levels of language. It's a truly wonderful book and in a really great translation.
The shortlist included 4 other books, one by Xi, the Hong Kong writer, called Morning Abreast, The Colonel and the Eunuch by Mai Jia, translated by Dylan Levy-King, and also Jeremy Tiang, your translation of Delicious Hunger by Hai Fan. And the other one was Yihan Lin's novel Fang Siche's First Love Paradise, translated by Jenna Tang. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that was a really lovely novel, which is also from Taiwan, although the subject was rather gruesome, difficult to read because it was about exploitative relationship and sexual predation. And Mourning a Breast was about what Shishi, the writer, feels when she has a mastectomy.
So interestingly, of those five books on the shortlist, only one is from mainland China, and that is The Colonel and the Eunuch by Mai Jia, who became initially famous for writing spy stories, which were made into Chinese TV series very successfully in the 2000s. And this book delves into 20th century Chinese history through one character who's been caught up in the revolutionary era and all the political upheavals. Do you think it's significant that of the five books you chose, only one was from mainland China?
This is a really hard question to answer. We had to choose the books we thought were best, literary excellence, and those were the ones we chose. I'd
Okay,
like to hear what Jeremy thinks.
sure. So Jeremy, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about this book, Delicious Hunger by Hai Fan, who was a member of the Malaysian Communist Party, who remained fighting on the borders of Malaysia and Thailand right up till the late 1980s. And these are his stories based very much on his own experiences.
Yes, that's right. So it's actually the Malayan Communist Party because it was set up before Malaysia even existed. And yeah, Haifan grew up in Singapore. Then at the age of 23, he chose to go to Malaysia and to spend the next 13 years in the rainforest as a guerrilla. And he emerged after the peace treaty of 1989, eventually was allowed to return to Singapore, and then lived a blameless life writing fiction about his experiences in the rainforest. Delicious Hunger is the first book-length translation of his work, and I would say one of the few accounts of life in the rainforest as a communist guerrilla that is literary rather than sociological or propagandistic.
You yourself have translated a very wide range of Chinese writing now. A lot of mainland writers, including Yenge Ling and Yenge. And then you worked with the writer Zhang Yueran, and you did particularly this novel Cocoon, which is a huge work about memory and, again, political movements and how they affected people through the Cultural Revolution and beyond. And you've done Chan Ho-kei, the Hong Kong novelist detective stories as well. But this is quite a departure. I mean, it's interesting that a book like this, which is very movingly written, but I don't know if it would reach a huge audience, but it's very interesting that this was published. How did it come about that you worked on this Hai Fan collection of stories?
I came to work on it essentially because I am from Singapore and I do feel a particular responsibility to translate work from Singapore because I don't think it's on a lot of people's radars. I was in a bookshop in Singapore when I found this book by Hai Fan, and this was before he was starting to get a lot of attention. And I was very curious because that is an interest of mine, the Malayan Communist Party. And so I picked it up, and then I knew I had to translate it. To Nikki's point, I do think that although Chinese is spoken in a lot of countries which have thriving literary scenes, China has tended to dominate, partly for historical reasons and partly just because of sheer size and scale. So I do try to bring other works into the light whenever I can, particularly from Singapore and Malaysia, and also from Taiwan, because I think we're seeing this across a lot of languages. In the French translation world, for a long time, France dominated, but now we're starting to hear from Francophone Africa, for example. So people are taking note about where else a language is used other than in the country that might have come to dominate that particular language and try to excavate works from there for translation. So the exciting thing about the Baifang Shell Prize is that it does look across the entire Chinese-speaking world. I think it would be less effective as a prize if it only focused on mainland China.
From what you're saying, you're actually suggesting that as a translator, you can play a part in the choice of books that are coming to the market, as it were. How much agency or how much influence do you think translators can have? And I'm sure Nikki will have opinions on this as well.
So this is going to vary a lot from language to language, but in the Chinese-speaking world, not that many writers have agents.
Do you
So
mean particularly mainland Chinese writers?
no, just Chinese language writers in general. There are few rights agents working in mainland China and Taiwan, and there's agencies like Greyhawk. Greyhawk does excellent work bringing work from Taiwan into the English-speaking world, but they're few and far between. And it's not quite the same situation where book scouts very much have their eye on, say, the major German publishers. When something comes out, everyone knows about it.
And is this
Um,
really a linguistic issue that there's just not that many people in the sort of international publishing industry who read Chinese?
That's part of it, but it's also just about the network of relationships that leads a book from its original language into English. If people aren't looking at a particular part of the world, yes, there aren't that many people in the publishing world who read Chinese, but they can and do commission me or other translators to do book reports. But they have to hear about the book first. And often the way they hear about the book is because we translators read it and bring it to their attention. Like, I don't know how long it would have taken for the English language publishing world to discover Haifan organically. And that's true of many other books that are under the radar. If it doesn't win a major award, and actually sometimes even if it does, it still takes that extra push to, translate a synopsis and sample, often for free, and put it in front of many, many publishers, saying this might not be a context you're familiar with, but I think it's worth your attention. And finally, getting someone to agree with you and publish it. Like, it is a long process.
So in this case, you did play a part in bringing this book to the sort of English language market.
Yeah, I translated individual short stories, placed them in literary journals. I enthused about the book to every publisher I
Mm.
met, wrote a synopsis, translated a sample, sent it around, and eventually I was lucky enough to bring it to Tilted Access Press, a wonderful publisher based in the UK, and they're willing to look outside of the mainstream and provide a platform to voices that otherwise might not be heard.
And Nikki, you've been translating for several decades and you've done a wide range of writers. What's your feeling about how much influence you can have on what's being published?
It's difficult to quantify. As Jeremy says, I get my personal favorite author and I try my best to find a publisher. That is actually really quite difficult to do. It takes a long time. But I think I can say more positively that once the book has been published, if it's a small publisher, often there's a role for the translator, translators, sometimes also the author, to organise their own promotion. So a woman I was going to mention, Annabelle Yang Hao, who's currently in Dublin. Michael Day and I translated her novel Diablo's Boys, about two young men who are fixated on video games and each other. It's a really good novel. It's just come out with Balestier. However, there hasn't been much promotion. So we are organising promotion in Dublin. It's the kind of thing you can do. You can have online meetings, you can put it on YouTube. And that's the thing I really enjoy doing as a translator.
That brings us very much to the question of what the market is for literature translated from the Chinese language, whether it's from mainland China or from other parts of the world. And so maybe that's a good point to bring in Daniel Lee from Sinoist Books. And Sinoist is one of the few publishers specifically focused on publishing books translated from the Chinese language or books with a Chinese aspect or connection in English. And that's been going on now for about 8 years, I believe, Daniel. Can you tell us a little bit about why Sinoist wanted to do this list, why you wanted to focus on bringing a lot of young Chinese writers, but also some of the older writers, people who became famous in the 1980s, like Feng Jicai or Jia Pinghua, whose novel Old Kiln you've recently published to quite a lot of acclaim. Why do you think that the world needs this type of a publishing list? And also, how easy is it to get the market to respond?
Well, I mean, there's the reason we say out loud, and then there's the private reason, right? So the reason we say out loud very much is, inclusion, representation, and getting Chinese its moment in the sun, basically, in the global literary landscape. But the reason we tell ourselves very much is quite personal. So Sinoist Books is part of Alan Charles Asia, which has been around since the late 1980s. And Sinos Books started in 2016, basically as something that personally I find very puzzling about the UK publishing landscape, which is when you go into a bookshop in the UK, you see nothing that would appeal to a person like me. And just to give everyone a bit of context, despite the American accent, I am a Chinese, born in Beijing, and then grew up in the UK since I was 8, so the year 2000. And there's nothing really in that bookshop that really speaks to me.
Do you mean in terms of contemporary Chinese literature?
In terms of Chinese literature, anything Sinophone as a whole, basically. To give you an idea of where the market is right now, translated literature makes up in the UK of trade fiction publishing about 5% of the market overall. So this is every single language coming into English. Chinese is 2% of that 5%. So that means it's 0.1% overall, or 1 in 1,000 books, basically. So for 20%, 1 in 5 humans in the world, that seems very, very bad just from a pure mathematical perspective. And so it's something we're working on addressing. And the thing we found basically as we got into this is that there has been numerous reasons, one way or another, that the Chinese publishing trade, when it comes to translation, basically it not meshing into the gears of the UK publishing trade or Anglophone in general. You see like indications of this like up and down the supply chain. Like Jeremy mentioned earlier on about agents, that certainly is a factor of it. Readers certainly are a factor, but also, once you get into the kind of behind the scenes processes, there's all sorts of different disciplines inside publishing that requires specific China sector knowledge that basically doesn't exist currently.
So you're suggesting that the Chinese publishing industry is just not very connected to the outside world?
Yes, and it has a lot to do with history, certainly. I mean, China only adopted the international conception of copyright in 2003, 2004. And there's a lot of still learning to this day that still happens behind the scenes. And then on top of that, obviously, you have a vastly different kind of publishing environment on either end who are used to doing things their own way. And trying to act as an intermediary between the two has been one of the kind of challenges of the press.
I mean, your company actually is now putting out, I believe, on average, at least one new book per month. And you've got a whole range of writers, including you've got new books from Su Tong, the well-known Chinese novelist. Also, this book called The Unfilial by Yao Mei, which is subtitled Four Tragic Tales from Modern China, talking about how women are the ones left to pick up the pieces when things go wrong. And you've got books by Dong Xi, I believe, a sort of migrant worker story, and another book which is subtitled Absurd Tales of Working Class China, Yellow Gold by Yi Zhou. So you've really got quite a diverse range. And as I say, also novels by older writers like Jia Pinghua, and you've got Fang Fang, who's writing on the COVID time in Wuhan, became both controversial but widely read internationally. So how are you actually choosing these books? And am I right in thinking that you're mainly doing these books through cooperation with mainland Chinese publishers?
Indeed. And I think it would help to preface to say that translation in the Anglophone market specifically is incredibly original government or state dependent, basically. So because the market is so small, pretty much every single translated book currently in the English market today has some sort of benefactor involvement from somewhere, basically.
So you're talking about funding for, from maybe arts agencies or organizations for these translations to be made.
Indeed. So that's like organizations for example, in Germany, like the Goethe Institute, or in the Netherlands, like Netherlands Liederfonds or the Japan Foundation. They play pretty much a kind of pivotal role when it comes to getting books translated into English.
You're basically looking for people to help you fund the translations for each book, are you?
Indeed. And so when it comes to the Chinese side, when we partner with Chinese publishers, they basically give us access to things like translation grants and things like, publicity opportunities. But with that comes, a certain amount of influence in that. And part of the balancing act we have to play as publishers basically is drawing that Venn diagram of things that the Chinese publishing sector would like to push and things that would actually match the UK market. That we call that internally the euphemistically development, basically. So like we get suggestions of things we should do from a wide variety of different sources. Some of it come from like Nikki and Jeremy, translation recommendations. We also do our own reading, and we also get recommendations from publishers as well and things like that. And then what you see currently on our list probably represents 1/3 of the books we've ever developed, basically. So for every one book you see on the list, there's two that we really wanted to do, but never got an opportunity to do so, basically. And it's playing that game well has been one of the things that kind of allowed us to get to our current position about roughly around 10 to 15 books a year.
Do you feel that the interest in, let's say, mainland Chinese fiction is as strong today as it ever has been? Or, we clearly saw a period over the past few years with COVID and with political tensions between China and the West, where perhaps global fascination for China diminished in some ways or became less positive. Nikki, what do you feel about the sort of interest in Chinese writing today?
My gut feeling is that, yes, there's a political prejudice against mainland Chinese writing. But on the positive side, I think that publishers, readers, bookshops are gradually learning a bit more slowly about Chinese language publishing in English translation. I would say since I started in 2000, 2001, there are far more translators and there's far more being published and far greater variety. You can't forget also genre fiction like sci-fi.
Like, of course, the three-body problem, the famous
Yeah.
novel by Liu Cixin.
So, on the whole, things are looking up. They're looking up slowly.
And you mentioned at the beginning this question of whether or not the books that you're working on or the books that are being translated contain a sort of internal dialogue and that are really exploring the thoughts and the psychology of the characters. Do you feel that there's an issue that may hold back some Chinese writing, that the characters are less developed? Is that what you're suggesting about some of the contemporary writing?
I mean, it's really hard to make generalizations. There are
But
books which seem to go and then, and then, and then, and things keep happening in sequence. But obviously, a really well-written book, even if it's mainly narrative of what's happening, will involve the building of characters, the reading inside of characters, what is happening with those characters. So a lot of it is to do with the skill of the writers. And I think some writers are really good at describing interior landscapes.
It's really hard to generalize about Chinese literature or even mainland Chinese literature because, as Daniel points out, it is 1 in every 5 human beings on the planet. What is true is that often the publishing world and readers have a limited view because of how little of it has historically been published and given a spotlight. So when I was talking to Granta about the China issue that they did recently, there was a lot of, I would say, discovery because many readers who consider themselves knowledgeable hadn't really read past Mo Yan or Su Tong and were surprised that contemporary writers had moved on and weren't just writing about the countryside or feudal society. I mean, there's such a spectrum of voices out there that there's Yanke writing very specifically from her Sichuanese hometown and telling these surreal dialect-inflected tales. There's Shuang Xuetao writing from the Rust Belt of northeastern China. There's Zhang Yueran, who's very much in conversation with what she sees as an international literary landscape. There's so many people doing so many different things that I don't think we can narrow it down to Chinese writers are doing this or not doing that. Whatever kind of literature or voice you want to find, if you look for it, it's there.
And I mean, you don't feel that the political situation in China, where clearly there is censorship and the acceptability of what can be published has perhaps been tightened, become a little bit more stricter in recent years. We've certainly seen some crackdowns on writing with LGBT themes, for example. You don't feel that that's significantly holding back the quality of writing from mainland China?
I mean, obviously, censorship isn't ideal, but I will say that many mainland Chinese writers have been using the constraints of censorship to get ever more ingenious and creative. They're adept at knowing exactly how far they can go and just pushing right up to that edge. and anyone who can read between the lines knows what they're saying. So no, I don't think the censorship or the restrictions mean that they are playing it safe or being less creative by any means. In many ways, it fosters creativity. I sound like I'm apologizing for censorship. I feel like I should say again, censorship is bad.
You're currently working on a project involving Yenlian Ke, who's a Beijing-based writer who's been, very much part of the official Chinese system and of the Writers Association, these bodies which, pay people's salaries apart from anything else traditionally in China. But he's also had a number of his books banned. Do you think he's a good example of people who, despite all those challenges in China, are still writing important and interesting fiction?
Yes, absolutely. He's not giving up. He's incredibly prolific. And although he is, disheartened, he keeps going and he's tremendously energetic. He teaches creative writing. He writes nonstop and he will not be silenced. So I think all I can do is bring his work to other readers, if not readers in China, which he is still writing for, even if he can't be read there.
And Daniel, I think you've also suggested that in a way, readers should trust the writers, as it were, that they understand what they can and can't do, but they're still determined to try and tell stories.
Firstly, let me echo Jeremy's point. Censorship is bad. That being said, I would say most of the time, what I'm finding in general is kind of the decision making, the powers that be on the Anglo side, basically. Perception of censorship is most of the time, in my experience, the limiting factor of Chinese works getting successful in the Anglosphere, as opposed to actual censorship on the Chinese side.
Do you mean that international publishers assume that the quality of writing is not good because of censorship?
I would say probably downstream of that, publishers are fairly pragmatic, right? Because if they can make money somewhere, they'll certainly do it. But one of the things they'll look at is, for example, okay, can I get this reviewed anywhere? And the thing that we really found with the old kiln process when getting it onto publications such as the FT, Spectator, and Irish Times,
So that's Jiapinghua's novel, Old Kiln.
is that editors also have their own views on China, and that quite often proves to be a limiting factor in terms of whether or not a book can get publicity or not. So, for example, the Old Kiln is about the Cultural Revolution, which I think if any Anglosphere reader has heard about events, it'll be something like the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. That is the kind of knowledge base you're dealing with. And trying to find a way to sell such a complex issue such as modern China onto that is incredibly complicated. Generally, what we find the best approach to is kind of find a hook that is independent from the original Chinese context and that is relevant to the current Anglophone context. So, for example, Old Kiln, the hook we found in the end was America is going into its own cultural revolution, not our idea. This idea has been drifting around since ever since Trump got elected for the second time. But kind of hooking a warning from the past basically onto that has proven very, very effective.
It's interesting that you mention that book which you've just published, The Old Kiln, is a story that's focused on the Cultural Revolution. And there still seem to be quite a lot of books coming out of China, or at least now getting translated and published, which are on this theme. And, this is obviously a theme from 50 years ago or more now. Do you think, maybe, Nikki, I can ask you now, do you feel that there's still a need for more writing on this theme? Do you feel that the kind of processing of the Cultural Revolution is not complete? Because, obviously, officially it was classified as a very bad thing back in the late 1970s after it finished. But there perhaps is a sense, at least in political terms now, that it's not a topic that the Chinese leadership want to discuss very much. Do you think that we're seeing the continuing sort of need for this to be thought through?
Well, I mean, it was a very traumatic 10 years for the people who lived through it. And it wasn't that long ago, as you say, 50 years ago. So, yes, I can quite understand why writers continue to want to explore it. And yes, I have heard of one writer that I've translated, Han Dong, wrote a novel, his first novel, called Striking Route, which was translated as Banished. And he's told me that there is a trend to reissue previously published novels, and that significant portions of that novel, which was about the Cultural Revolution, were taken out in the reissued version. I haven't looked and I haven't seen which bits were taken out, but as you say, there are quite a lot of people in authority who'd really rather that discussion of the Cultural Revolution stopped.
You mean that that book was initially published in China, and then when it's been republished more recently, they've taken things out of it?
Yes.
And Jeremy, as we said, you worked with Zhang Yueran, the relatively young Chinese writer, on several of her books, including Cocoon, which again is a story which has a lot of resonance from the Cultural Revolution into the modern age. I think Zhang Yueran herself has said that, when she wrote this book, older people would say to her, oh, well, that's a story for older writers to talk about. Why is your younger generation interested in it? But do you feel that it's still important that there are people writing these kind of stories?
I think as long as there is something new to say about the Cultural Revolution, then people are going to keep saying it. As Nikki says, it was a greatly traumatic event that had repercussions for decades to come. And a lot of the writing about it had been from people who lived through it, understandably. Like there's a whole genre, scar literature, that is about working through this trauma.
Those were the works that were coming out in the late 1970s and early 80s, or the 1980s in general, perhaps, when it was fresh in people's minds, the scar literature.
Yes, exactly. And for someone like Zhang Yueran, who was born in the prosperous 80s and who never lived through it, but who grew up in this world where this thing had happened that all the adults around her had lived through, but no one was talking about, trying to process that is completely different, a completely different perspective on the event. And people of her generation weren't really writing about it. So, yes, I do think there was a need for someone from her generation to say, okay, let's talk about this thing that all our parents went through and refused to discuss with us.
And Daniel, so with Sinoist, among the authors you publish, you have people like Feng Jicai from Tianjin in northern China, who famously wrote a book in which he collected the sort of oral histories of 100 people and their experiences of the Cultural Revolution, which I think the English version was called 10 Years of Madness. I mean, that wasn't one that you published, but you've published other works of his and his essays about Tianjin. And you seem to be focusing on quite a lot of people of his generation. You've got Tianning and Shi Tiesheng. We mentioned Jia Pinghua already. Is Sinoist in a way trying to fill some blanks or some gaps in terms of what has been published in the West, that writers from the 1980s or 90s, their whole back catalogue has never actually been translated into English? I mean, there are obviously a few writers like Mo Yan and maybe to a lesser extent Yu Hua who've had most of their works translated, but presumably you feel that there are still gaps to be filled in.
Translation publishing is an inherently anti-trend activity.
Anti-trend
activity, just by its very nature, simply because it takes from initial discussion of a book to having the actual article in your hand, at least from the publishing perspective, is anywhere up to 2 to 3 years. And trends come and go in 6 months increments, right? So if you're chasing a trend, you're always going to be out of date. And when we first started the press, very much it's kind of looking for stuff in kind of the Chinese speaking world that would have universal appeal and would not only be relevant to the original Chinese audience, but also relevant to the kind of Anglophone context it now finds itself in. So just to kind of jump back onto the Cultural Revolution point with Old Kiln, I mean, the book itself details basically the Cultural Revolution arriving at this kind of very rural, very out of the middle of nowhere village. And once it gets down into the local context, it very much becomes these angry young men pointing fingers at each other and saying, your clan has wronged my clan several generations ago, and now I'm going to use this political opportunity, which has been sent down from on high, as an opportunity to get even. I mean, I'm not sure about anyone else, but that does sound like the times we live in. And when we are talking to end users at things like book fairs, that's what they're clicking with, and that's what they're finding relevant in their own lives. And that's what we think the kind of older generation of writers, as you say, brings to the table, because they in their kind of domestic market has stood the test of time, right? The reason why people still talk about them to this day is because they found some sort of universal relevance that's beyond the times that they found themselves in.
Well, Nikki, you've actually also been now looking a little bit further back into the back catalogue of Chinese writing in the 20th century, and you're working on a collection of stories, or in fact the complete stories, I believe, of Ling Shuhua, who was a Chinese writer who had connections with the Bloomsbury set from the 1930s onwards and later moved to Britain. So why have you chosen to look further back?
Well, to my shame, I only discovered Ling Shuhua and her short stories a relatively short time ago. A collection did actually appear in Italian. A writer friend of mine had read the Italian and said, "Why is there no English collection?" I started to read them and I found that they're incredibly well written and stand comparison with anything that's being written nowadays. And they're very much focused on women, their inner feelings, their rebellion, their successes, their failures, women in a very different society. But as the way Daniel describes it, it has resonances for all readers, all women, men and women. Nowadays, her analysis of their feelings is forensic and very sharp. They're also delightfully short and they're wonderful. I was lucky enough to get a grant from the Society of Authors to pursue the project. I've been able to embark on translating the whole lot, and it's much easier to find a publisher if you can present the whole collection to them. She's an author from the past who I think is really worth rediscovering. And this is one of the delights of Chinese language fiction. As Jeremy said, you do find such a huge variety, present and past, different genre, different areas, and different styles.
And maybe still quite a lot from further back in the 20th century, which still is not widely available in English. I mean, Jeremy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I was struck by the fact that, for example, Penguin Classics, I think, did a reissue of Lu Xun's classic short stories from the early 20th century, translated by Julia Lovell. They've also published Lao She, the great satirical writer and novelist. But there are plenty of the big novels of the 1930s in China, which, when I was studying Chinese some decades ago, were being talked about a lot, like Mao Dun's Midnight, or the writings of Ba Jin, who was inspired by the anarchists, of course. They were seen as classics at some point in the 1980s, but they seem to have fallen off the bookshelf or the publishers' lists. I mean, do you feel that there's still more 20th century writing that deserves to be rediscovered or retranslated?
Yes, I do think this is essential work. I've tended to work with contemporary writers because my interest is in collaboration, and I like to kind of develop things together with them. But one of the missing pieces of context with contemporary writers and placing these writers with publishers and getting them to readers is this deep literary history that many writers are in conversation with. So if a contemporary Francophone writer drops in a Proust reference, that's absolutely fine. Everyone can cope with that. But a contemporary Chinese writer drops in a Mao Dun or Lao She reference. These writers, who were active not that long ago and should be widely known, are often just a blank to Anglophone readers. And that presents a huge problem, but also could be a virtuous circle in that the more Chinese writing that gets translated, the more contemporary publishers and readers have a context for it, and it becomes easier and easier to get into this world. It's no longer so opaque. It's all there. It just needs to be translated and read.
Looking at future prospects, I mean, what are your feelings about the potential for Chinese writing in the coming decades? Obviously there are a lot of writers. There are more and more channels, despite censorship, for people to publish things on the internet, for example, which is a huge part of the Chinese literary world, although perhaps has not crossed over that much into conventional publishing. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's perhaps more of an awareness now of Chinese writing from places other than mainland China. Do you see that, despite political tensions, there are good prospects for writing to develop and for important writing to be produced in mainland China and beyond? Or are the challenges of the sort of commercial factors and the way that the internet is leading to people writing some, perhaps less highbrow fiction, which is attracting a lot of eyes and a lot of readers? Is that undermining the quality of what's coming out?
I think an important thing to point out is that, particularly with mainland Chinese writers, they don't need translation. That's a domestic market of over 1 billion people. Many of them have very strong sales. So they're writing very much for the readers around them. They're not necessarily thinking about the Anglophone world. And I think that makes the work tremendously exciting and different and strong. There are more and more MFA programs in China. There's a kind of professionalization of the industry.
These are programs where people can go to learn how to write fiction in universities, are they?
Yes, I mean, it's not quite like the English language world. The one that Zhang Yueran teaches on at Renmin University in Beijing is only open to published writers. So you have to have already published a book to enroll in this MFA program. But people are thinking more seriously about craft. People are thinking about what it means to be a writer. People are trying to connect with a wider range of readers. It feels like there's a lot of energy and creativity. So I have a lot of optimism for the future of Chinese literature. And I think it's really now on us as translators and publishers and readers to bring it into the English speaking world. It's there, there's amazing literature out there, and we just need to provide a home for it.
You mentioned the separateness of the Chinese literary world and the way that it can exist in its own bubble, perhaps without the West if necessary. There's one issue which I've noticed that, when you talk to Chinese writers about the editing process of their books, it often sounds like the editing is relatively light. And, there are many writers who've produced very, very long novels. I think, Nikki, you mentioned one of Jia Pinghua's novels was 1,000 pages. I mean, is there an issue that writing is perhaps not as well edited as it could be? Daniel, I don't know what you feel about this from your point of view.
This seems to be one of those quirks of the Chinese market, right? Where just like there's a general trend of shortening books here in the Anglophone trade, it seems that works of a certain stature seems to only get lengthier in the Chinese trade. What we suspect is happening is a wide variety of tenants of the planned economy where they only can charge a certain amount of money for a certain amount of words on a page, basically.
Writers need to make things longer to earn their money.
Indeed. I remember hearing a joke about how authors are paid on a per word basis, but they're taking pity on poets who only get so many words, right? And just to jump back to its potential in the Anglophone trade, I think one of the best things I've ever heard it described to me, publishing as an activity is that it's a tax on hope. Publishing is a tax on hope. And from our point of view, if you keep up this activity for long enough, and especially if you nurture a team behind it, which is adapting from China into the Anglophone market, I think success is only a matter of time. And for that, we have precedents from the Korean to English market and the Japanese to English market. Korean didn't exist in the 2010s. Now it very much is a force in the publishing market. And once we reach a sufficient critical mass of this personnel, success is only a matter of time.
So going back a bit, I just want to say that Chinese writers are not writing in a bubble. They're not thinking towards an Anglophone readership, but they're not in a bubble by any means because there's a tremendous amount of translation into Chinese. When you walk into a Chinese bookstore, half the fiction books will be from other languages. And when I'm talking to a Chinese writer, they can tell me all about the latest Ian McEwan or Sally Rooney. And on the point about editing, it's helpful to get away from the idea of good or bad editing as just thinking about different reading norms. And in the Chinese speaking world, yes, there is less structural editing. It's discursive. The author is given all the space they need to make their point. There's a lot of line editing, so the language is beautiful, But you would seldom say to a Chinese author, you don't really need that first chapter, do you? That's their creative vision, and that's the space they're allowed. Sometimes that first chapter needs to be removed because an Anglophone audience is impatient and wants to get straight to the point. But it's really just different literary norms. It's not about one culture being better or worse than another.
I would also like to add that a lot of good Chinese writers are very much aware of the need to, I can't exactly call it self-edit, but serious revisions. So you come to the end of a Chinese novel and you often find that the writer has written first draft, second draft, final draft, and there will be a year between the first and the final. So they're working incredibly hard on their stories in just the same way as Western writers are working hard on their stories.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us, Jeremy Tiang, Daniel Lee, and Nikki Harman, and for a really insightful discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you.
Thanks for convening us.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about our SOAS China Institute events and our corporate membership scheme, and read our latest blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for your time and goodbye.